I'm from New Hampshire, just outside Concord. I was in my early 20s, recently single after a 2-year relationship ended. It was a weird time in my life, the kind where you're adrift, searching for meaning without even realizing it. My grandma was deeply religious, attending Mass every Sunday without fail. After my grandpa passed, a decorated veteran, well known and respected in our small town, I started going to church with her. His death left a huge hole in her life, but her faith was unshakable. She told me she knew he was with God, and I could see the comfort it brought her. I admired that kind of faith, the kind that brings genuine peace. It felt rare, like something everyone searches for their whole lives, even if they don't always find it. One Sunday after service, I met this girl. The whole thing still feels like a bad dream. I'd never seen her before, which was unusual in our tight-knit community, especially at church. She stood out, with dark, curly hair and hazel eyes. I waited until the service ended and approached her. Part of me was just drawn to her, but another part was curious about a new face, especially someone around my age. We started talking, and there were definitely sparks. I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about, that instant connection you feel with someone. Her name was Kelly, and she had this quiet, mysterious allure. I was hooked. I tried asking specific questions about her past, like her family and where she grew up, but she'd laugh and tell me I'd have to take her out to get the real answers. I liked that playfulness. After a little more back and forth, she told me her family had just moved to the area, and she was attending the state university, which explained why I hadn't seen her before. By the time we parted ways, I'd gotten her number, and I was genuinely excited to have met someone new. Over the next week, we texted pretty regularly and exchanged social media info. I remember checking out her Instagram at some point, surprised she had so few followers. I liked that, though. The last thing anyone wants is to fall for someone the whole world knows. We talked about a lot, and she finally opened up more about her family. I don't want to say too much, but her situation wasn't great. Her stepfather was a mean drunk who was abusive towards both her and her mother. Her biological father was significantly worse, though she didn't give me specifics. It was clear they moved to get away from him. New school, new state. She left everyone and everything she knew behind. I didn't want to overstep and pry about her father. I was just glad she was opening up to me. I loved that calculated mystique, but it was nice getting to know her on a more personal level. I should have asked her out right then, but I figured I'd see her at church the following Sunday. She was there, which I took as a sign. I asked her out after the service, and she didn't hesitate. She just smiled and said yes. We planned to meet later that week. I spent the rest of the week thinking about her, nervous about our first date. When the night finally arrived, we kept it simple, dinner and a movie. Nothing fancy, just an easy night so we could talk and get to know each other better. I genuinely thought it went really well. She was a great listener and seemed genuinely interested, which was refreshing. I didn't want the night to end just yet, so after dinner, I suggested we go for a drive, figuring it would give us a chance to keep talking without the noise of a restaurant. We got on the highway, driving out of town a bit. We were on one of those roads that's technically a highway, but it felt more like a regular 2-lane road, winding through trees. Everything was perfect. It's crazy how fast things can change. What I'm about to describe is something I'll never be able to erase from my memory. Suddenly, she started speaking, but not in English. The words were mumbled, rapid fire, and sounded almost like French or something similar. At first, I thought she was joking or messing with me, but then I noticed her eyes rolling back in her head, leaving only the whites. I swerved, nearly hitting the guardrail. My heart started pounding because it looked like she was having some kind of seizure or episode. I pulled over, trying to stay calm, but inside, I was panicking. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, not knowing what to say other than I thought she was having a seizure. While waiting, I kept checking on her, unsure if she even knew where she was. She was still speaking, and her head seemed to be vibrating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to touch her, but I felt like I had to do something. I've never been more terrified in my entire life. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. She turned her head towards me, her mouth closed. She blinked, her eyes returning to normal. and she looked at me with this wild, wide-eyed expression. I'll never forget that look as long as I live. Before I could say a word, she flung open the car door and ran full speed into the woods. I'll say it again. She ran into the woods. I was trying to process what just happened, but I just couldn't move. My head was spinning, and I'm pretty sure my hands were still shaking. I sat there until the police and paramedics arrived. I told them everything, even though it sounded insane, every detail about how her eyes looked and how she ran off. They nodded and took my statement, assuring me they'd do their best to find her. I must have looked crazy, but they were serious enough with me. After that night, though, she was gone. I never saw her again. I looked for her at church, but she never showed up. Her Instagram was deleted, and she'd obviously blocked my number. Worse, I had a friend text her number, and it was apparently disconnected. No amount of internet sleuthing turned up anything. I even asked around at church to see if anyone knew her, but no one did. I don't know what happened to her, and I'm not sure I ever will. I don't live there anymore, and the memory of my hometown is tainted by that incident. My family had this beat-up 2012 Chevy Malibu, practically on its last leg. I don't know what it was, but that thing refused to die. It had a million problems but kept running. This thing had a laundry list of issues. The brakes felt soft, the engine was erratic, and half the electronics barely worked. My parents were basically waiting for it to completely break down so they'd have an excuse to buy a new car. Unfortunately, I was the one stuck driving it. On top of all the other problems, the windshield wipers didn't work at all, so driving in the rain was a death sentence. Even a light drizzle was enough to completely obscure the driver's view. Everyone knows Nevada is a dry state, but even so, rain isn't usually a major concern where I lived. I remember elementary school teachers always overhyping it for some reason. Anyway, it was summer a few years ago, and I was on my way back from a solo road trip to visit my buddy Kevin a few states over, a friend I hadn't seen in years. I enjoy driving, so I figured I'd make an adventure out of it, just driving by myself through stretches of empty desert. The trip was great. I stayed at his place for a few nights, and we did a lot of catching up. It was a fantastic time, and I'm glad I made the effort. Most of the drive back was smooth sailing, but that didn't last because, as I entered Nevada, a huge storm hit. Not just a drizzle or light rain, but a full-blown thunderstorm, complete with lightning and torrential downpour. I later found out it was one of the biggest rainstorms we'd seen in years. I'd driven in rain before, but nothing like this. It didn't really make much difference with the current state of my windshield wipers, though. Any amount of rain was going to force me to pull over, so that's what I did. I pulled off the highway and parked a fair distance into the desert, just in case a truck or something didn't see me. I figured I had no choice but to wait it out, maybe try to get some sleep in the car. I considered calling the highway patrol for help with the wipers, but money was tight, and I wanted to avoid a ticket at all costs. Besides, if it wasn't the wipers, something else would definitely strand me somewhere else. I wasn't about to ask my 65-year-old parents to drive 3.5 hours to rescue me, so sitting and waiting was all I could do. There I was, alone on the side of the road in a thunderstorm, in the middle of the desert. Not a single car passed me for an hour, and the storm didn't even let up a little. I think being alone in the desert started to mess with me because, after another hour or so, I got this uneasy feeling. I'm not sure what it was, but I had this inexplicable urge to move the car. It was still pouring rain, so obviously, I couldn't do that safely. I found myself anxiously looking out the car windows, as if something was out there. Obviously, there wasn't. All I could see were miles and miles of rocks and endless desert, though the sun was starting to set, which meant I'd soon be surrounded by darkness. I hadn't expected the storm to last so long, so the reality of having to spend the night out in the desert hadn't even occurred to me. I'll fully admit the thought of not being able to see what was out there freaked me out. I'm not easily scared, but I'd heard enough desert stories to be understandably cautious. As if my thoughts were being read, the storm started to die down a little. I took that as a sign I'd be able to get back on the road soon. I was relieved. The sun began to set, casting a strange, silent sunset over the desert. Under different circumstances, I would have admired its beauty, but that damn rain still wouldn't stop. so I had no choice but to stay put. I tried to focus on the lightning in the distance, thinking maybe that would make me feel better. I don't remember how much longer I waited, but the sun finally set completely. At that point, I decided waiting was a waste of precious battery power, and I'd be better off trying to get some shut-eye. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I saw flashes of light in the distance. This time, it wasn't lightning, but sharp, white beams cutting through the darkness. They seemed to be jumping around like they were coming from multiple sources. It was incredibly eerie. I watched them for a few more minutes before realizing they were getting closer. They were actually headed towards me. I could feel my palms starting to sweat. I didn't know what was going on, but instinct kicked in, and I made a split-second decision to get out of the car and hide. I grabbed my phone and scrambled out, taking cover behind the nearest rock formation. It was still raining, but I didn't care. I could feel my heart racing, and I prayed the sound of the rain would mask the sound of my breathing. Crouching low, I peeked around the edge of the rocks and watched my car from a distance. After a few minutes, I realized the lights were flashlights. I saw 3 figures moving towards my car from a distance. They each held a flashlight, swinging their beams erratically, like they were dancing or stumbling or something. It was unusual, to say the least. They circled my car, inspecting it, like they were searching for something or someone. The way they were swinging those flashlights, it was like they were on something. I squinted, trying to make out details, but it was too dark to see much. Then, without warning, one of them fired a gunshot into the air. I jumped, completely caught off guard, and bit my lip hard enough to draw blood. Every instinct told me to stay as quiet as possible, to make myself invisible behind those rocks. For what felt like forever, I stayed frozen, afraid to peek out. Finally, curiosity became unbearable. Slowly, I peered around the rocks again, and my stomach dropped. It was pitch black, no flashlights. I waited, wondering where they'd gone, and then, just like that, the lights were flickering around my car again, like they were taunting me. I knew I couldn't stay there all night. My hands shaking, I pulled out my phone and fumbled to dial 911. I whispered into the phone, trying to explain what was happening in a near inaudible voice. The dispatcher said they were sending someone, and I hung up, feeling both relieved and terrified. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the faint glow of police lights in the distance. As soon as the lights started flashing, the 3 figures turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. By the time the police actually pulled up next to my car, they were gone. I ran out into the rain, waving my arms, grateful to be rescued. The officer listened as I recounted everything. He didn't seem shocked, which made the whole thing even worse. He politely waited with me for the storm to pass and didn't tow my car, which I guess I could say was a good thing. I think about this a lot, and I haven't taken a long road trip since. What I'm about to tell you is the weirdest experience I've ever had. My name is Maria. My friend, Sarah, and I were driving from Florida back to New Jersey a few months ago. We were returning from visiting some friends who were attending college there. It was a really fun time, but Sarah and I had to get back to our own lives. The trip was supposed to be fun. A little road trip, just the 2 of us, with some snacks, music, and time to catch up on everything we hadn't talked about in a while. Looking back, it probably would have been a better idea to stay another night at my friend's place, but I wanted to get home. We planned to drive the whole way in one shot. We drove through the night, and by the next morning, a few hours after sunrise, my back was starting to ache from sitting in the same position for so long. I told Sarah we should stop somewhere to stretch our legs, get gas, and maybe grab something to eat before continuing. We drove past a few more exits before finally stopping at what was supposedly a bustling tourist town. I can't remember what the town's actual name was. One of those places you'd expect to be a tourist trap, with signs pointing to attractions and promises of quirky shops or local history. But even as we drove in, I felt like something was off. The streets were deserted, and the buildings looked like they'd seen better days. A little rundown for a place supposedly catering to tourists. It's hard to explain the feeling, but it was the kind of place where you could sense something was wrong without really knowing anything was wrong. I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. Have you ever driven through one of those ghost towns where all the shop signs are still up, but everything is clearly abandoned? Yeah, it was like that, only weirder because things weren't actually abandoned, they just looked that way. It wasn't your usual ghost town vibe, but it was strange enough that it stuck with me ever since. Our first stop was a convenience store. We actually had to drive for quite a while before we got into the town center, or whatever you call it. We pulled into the long lot and went inside to grab some refreshments. It looked normal enough inside. Actually, Sarah was looking for a specific kind of drink she wanted, but quickly got annoyed when she realized they didn't have it. She's a bit of a diva, so I indulged her tantrum and agreed to go somewhere else. I still wanted a Gatorade, though, so I took it up to the counter to pay. The cashier was a woman, maybe 30 or 35 if I had to guess. She had dark brown hair and was also fairly tall. Everything was perfectly normal. The only reason I remember her features so clearly is because she was wearing overalls, which I wasn't used to seeing. I paid for my drink and we left. Sarah pointed to another convenience store across the street, so we decided to try that one. As we walked into the second store, my stomach dropped. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the woman who'd been working at the first place. Same hair, same face, same height, same everything. I froze, staring at her. I could tell I was making her uncomfortable. I finally asked her if she had a twin sister or something. She gave me this weird, almost suspicious look and said she didn't have a twin, that she was an only child. She squinted and told me it was a strange question to ask, which I guess it was. I tried to explain myself, but she didn't say anything. I felt this weird, unsettling feeling, like I was experiencing déjà vu, and backed out of the store, pulling Sarah with me. Sarah was confused, but I explained myself and asked if she'd noticed the same thing. She said she didn't remember the other cashier looking like that and that I was probably just tired from driving so long. I knew what I saw, though, and told her I'd prove it. We drove back to the first convenience store, but when we got there, the woman inside looked nothing like the person I remembered seeing. She was a completely different person, shorter, with light-colored hair, and looked like she was middle-aged. There was absolutely no way anyone could mistake her for the other cashier. She didn't even look like she was the same age, like I'd imagined the whole thing. Sarah told me to drop it, that I was tired, but I insisted I wasn't imagining things. Eventually, I had no choice but to let it go. I desperately wanted to get out of there, but we needed gas. We stopped at the first gas station we saw, and there wasn't a soul in sight. Just our car, the pumps, and a small building in the back where you'd pay. We were literally the only car in the entire lot. We both walked inside. Sarah took forever looking for her drink, which, of course, they didn't have there either. I paid, waited for her, and we left. We couldn't have been out there more than a few seconds when, as we walked back out, I got that weird feeling in my gut again. The place that, only 2 seconds ago, had been a completely empty gas station, was now packed. I mean, packed with people. It was bizarre. Cars filled every pump, and there were even a few lined up, like we'd driven into rush hour at the busiest station in the state. All the spots in the back parking lot were taken, too. To make things worse, it felt like everyone was staring at us as we walked to our car. I don't think I've ever felt more uncomfortable with people staring at me than I did at that moment. This time, Sarah agreed that something strange was going on. I could tell we both felt it, this weird suspicion like we'd stepped out of reality for a second, and when we came back, something had changed. We decided to skip the food and just get back on the highway. I didn't have much of an appetite at that point. Anyway, back on the road, we didn't say much for a while. I wasn't scared, but I just had this uneasy feeling in my gut. I'm not sure how else to explain it. As we drove a bit further, Sarah and I started talking about how weird that all was. As we were talking, a car passed us, a Toyota Sienna with a cracked windshield. I remember it specifically because the windshield had this big spiderweb crack running across it, and the side was pretty badly scraped up. It was hard to miss. Sarah made a joke about it, but I can't remember exactly what it was. Just as we started to loosen up, things took another dive. About 10 minutes later, that same minivan passed us again. We were both 100% sure it was the same car. There was no mistaking that massive crack in the windshield. How was that even possible, though? We were driving on a straight road at a decent speed. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of us. And the odds of passing two different Siennas with the exact same windshield crack are ridiculously low. Sarah kept saying, "Oh my God." And I could tell she was on the verge of a panic attack. She told me to speed up. I did. I was freaking out internally, but I had to stay calm as the driver, and for Sarah. I didn't want anything more than to get back on the interstate and get the hell out of there. I glanced down at the GPS and saw that an hour had passed since we left the gas station. That was almost impossible. I wanted to tell Sarah about it, but I didn't know if she could handle any more weirdness. My heart was pounding, but I kept driving. Part of me wondered if the GPS was starting to take us in circles. Eventually, we made it back to the interstate, and the nightmare ended there. By the time we got home, though hours later, we felt like we were waking up from a strange, disjointed dream. I'm not kidding, that whole experience still feels like a dream when I think back on it. People usually look at me strangely when I tell them this story. I still can't explain what happened there, and I don't expect any explanations. I tried searching online for strange occurrences in places like that, and I actually found a few stories similar to mine. The weirdest thing about it is that feeling in my gut, the one I'm still having trouble describing. Up until that point, I didn't really know what that feeling of dread felt like. Like every bone in your body is begging you to realize something isn't right. I never want to have that feeling again.